The guard's spear was already moving toward my throat before I understood what I had done wrong. My name is Ethan Hale, and 3 seconds ago, I was just a junior aide standing quietly in the back row of a diplomatic hall, holding a small folded object wrapped in cloth. Now every insect-like eye in the throne chamber of the Vashtari Queen Mother was locked on me, and the air itself seemed to have stopped moving. I had not planned to step forward. I want to be honest about that, because what happened next changed everything, and I need you to understand that it started with something so small it barely felt like a decision at all. We had been briefed for 6 weeks before this meeting. 6 weeks of memorizing which words were forbidden, which postures were forbidden, which colors were forbidden to wear near the throne. Commander Laura Bennett had drilled our small delegation like soldiers preparing for battle, not diplomats preparing for tea. She kept saying the same thing, over and over, until it echoed in my skull even in my sleep. Do not deviate from the script. Do not improvise. Do not, under any circumstances, act on your own initiative in that room. I remember nodding along with everyone else, certain that following rules I did not fully understand would be the easiest part of this mission. The hard part, I thought, would be the flight out here, 3 weeks folded into a ship barely large enough for a dozen humans, breathing recycled air and eating food that tasted like cardboard trying to be soup. The Vashtari homeworld hung outside the viewport like a bruise, purple and swollen with storms, and I remember Peter Grant, the engineer sitting beside me, joking that it looked like a planet having a bad day. Nobody laughed. We were all too nervous. By the time we reached the surface, humanity had already spent 2 years exchanging careful signals with the Vashtari Empire. They were old, older than anything we had encountered before. Their ships did not look built so much as grown, curved black hulls that pulsed faintly like something breathing. Their empire stretched across dozens of star systems, and beneath their rule lived a dozen smaller species, all of them careful, all of them quiet, all of them clearly trained never to speak unless spoken to. We were the newest arrivals to that arrangement, and everyone on our side of the negotiating table understood that first impressions with an empire like this were not just important, they were survival. The throne chamber itself was unlike anything I had ever stood inside. The ceiling curved upward in ribs of pale stone, like standing inside the ribcage of something enormous and long dead. Light came from veins running through the walls, glowing faint amber, pulsing slowly like a heartbeat. The air smelled of something sweet and mineral, almost like burnt sugar and wet stone mixed together. Ambassador Henry Clark led our small procession, walking with the stiff, careful steps of a man trying very hard not to make a single wrong move. Behind him came Commander Bennett, then 2 translators, then myself and Peter, carrying nothing more important than data tablets and the folded gifts on the approved manifest. The approved manifest. I want to come back to that phrase, because it matters more than anything else in this story. Every item we brought as gifts for the Queen Mother had been reviewed, approved, and cross-checked against a document longer than most novels. Ceremonial crystal from Earth's northern mountains, a woven cloth made by artisans in a small coastal village, a recording of human orchestral music, carefully chosen to avoid anything with lyrics that could be misinterpreted. All of it had been vetted by both human diplomats and Vashtari liaisons for months. None of it included what I was holding. The Queen Mother sat at the far end of the chamber, elevated on a throne that seemed to grow directly out of the floor, black stone twisting upward into a seat shaped almost like a flower closing around her. She was larger than I expected, though not monstrous, her body long and elegant, covered in overlapping plates that shimmered faintly violet under the amber light. 4 eyes, arranged in a diamond pattern, tracked our procession with unsettling precision. Her attendants, dozens of them, knelt in rows along the walls, heads bowed so low their foreheads nearly touched the floor. I remember thinking, even then, that I had never seen so many living beings look so afraid of one single person. Ambassador Clark began the formal greeting exactly as rehearsed. His voice did not shake, though I could see the tension in his shoulders. The translator beside him repeated his words in the clicking, layered language of the Vashtari, and the Queen Mother's 4 eyes shifted slowly across our group, weighing each of us, as if deciding what we were worth. Everything proceeded exactly according to protocol. The exchange of formal titles, the recitation of terms already agreed upon in earlier talks, the presentation of the approved gifts, carried forward one at a time by Commander Bennett, placed with careful precision on a low stone platform before the throne. The Queen Mother said nothing during any of this. She simply watched, her attendants trembling slightly whenever her gaze passed over them, as though her attention itself carried weight. I stood in the back row, watching this ancient, terrifying figure receive tribute like a machine processing input, and something in me felt wrong about it. Not wrong in the sense of breaking protocol, wrong in a quieter, harder-to-explain way. She looked lonely. I know that sounds strange to say about a being who ruled an empire spanning dozens of worlds, surrounded by hundreds of attendants who existed only to serve her. But there is a particular kind of loneliness that comes from being surrounded by people who are too afraid to actually see you, and I recognized it because I had felt smaller versions of it myself, growing up in a house where everyone was too busy being careful around each other to ever be honest. I do not say this to excuse what I did next. I only say it because it is the truth, and this whole story only makes sense if you understand what was going through my mind in that moment. Earlier that morning, before we left our quarters, I had folded a small paper crane out of a napkin from our shared dining hall. It was a habit from childhood, something my grandmother taught me before she passed, a way to keep my hands busy when my mind felt overwhelmed. I had folded 3 of them that morning, without even realizing it, my fingers working automatically while my thoughts spun through worry about the meeting ahead. I had tucked one of them into my jacket pocket without thinking much of it. A nervous habit, nothing more. I had also, almost as an afterthought, written a short note on a scrap of paper and folded it inside the crane's body. It said something simple. Something about hoping the day went well for everyone in the room, human and Vashtari alike. I want to be clear that I did not plan to give it to her. I did not even remember it was in my pocket until the ceremony was almost finished. The formal gift exchange concluded. Ambassador Clark stepped back into line. The room settled into the tense quiet that comes after a ritual has been completed correctly, everyone waiting for the Queen Mother's response, whatever that would be. And in that quiet, I felt the small folded shape in my pocket, and some part of me, some old and stubborn and human part of me, decided that this moment needed something more than careful tribute. I stepped out of line. I heard Commander Bennett's sharp intake of breath behind me. I heard Peter whisper my name, low and urgent, a warning that came a half-second too late. I was already walking forward, past the approved platform, past the boundary we had been told never to cross without explicit permission, closer to the throne than any human had ever stood. The Vashtari attendants along the walls went rigid. I heard the faint scrape of the guards near the throne, shifting their weight, spears angling slightly toward me, though not yet raised. I stopped a respectful distance from the throne, close enough that the Queen Mother's 4 eyes fixed on me, with an intensity that made my chest tighten, far enough that I hoped, foolishly, that I had not already doomed our entire mission. I held out the small paper crane on my open palm. I did not have words prepared. I simply said, quietly, that it was a small thing, made by hand, and that I hoped she might accept it as a gift from one person to another, nothing more. The silence that followed was the loudest silence I have ever experienced. For a moment, nothing happened. The Queen Mother did not move. Her attendants did not move. Even Commander Bennett, standing rigid behind me, seemed to have forgotten how to breathe. Then the guards moved. 2 of them stepped forward from either side of the throne, spears lowering, points angling directly at me. I heard Ambassador Clark's voice crack as he began shouting something in Vashtari, some desperate attempt at an apology or an explanation, though I could not understand the words fast enough to know which. I felt my own heartbeat hammering in my ears, louder than anything else in that vast stone chamber, and I understood, with sudden and complete clarity, that I had just made the worst mistake of my life. But the Queen Mother raised one hand, a small gesture, barely more than a twitch of her fingers, and the guards froze instantly, spears still leveled at me but no longer advancing. Her 4 eyes remained locked on the paper crane resting in my palm. I did not move. I did not breathe. I simply stood there, offering a folded napkin to the most powerful being I had ever encountered, while an entire room full of armed guards waited for a single word that would decide whether I lived or died. The Queen Mother's gaze finally lifted from the crane to my face, and in that ancient, alien expression, in eyes that were nothing like human eyes, and yet somehow unmistakably readable in that instant, I saw something I never expected to see directed at me. I saw fear. Not fear of me. I was nothing to her, a single small creature from a species barely known to her empire. It was something deeper than that, something that made her plated shoulders tense in a way I did not understand yet, but would come to understand very soon. She reached out one long, clawed hand, and for one impossible moment, closed her fingers gently around the folded paper crane resting in my palm. The entire chamber seemed to hold its breath with me. Nobody moved for what felt like an entire minute, though it could not have been more than a few seconds. The Queen Mother's claws remained closed around the small paper shape, and I stood frozen with my hand still extended, unsure whether pulling it back would somehow make things worse. Then she spoke. Her voice, when the translator rendered it into words I could understand, was low and even, carrying none of the sharp authority I expected from someone who ruled an empire. Instead, it sounded almost careful, almost hesitant, as though she were testing each word before releasing it into the air. She asked what this object was called and what it meant. I answered as steadily as I could manage, though my voice came out quieter than I intended. I told her it was called a crane, a shape folded from paper, something children on my world learned to make. I told her that in some old traditions back home, folding 1,000 of these shapes was believed to grant a wish, though I had only ever managed a handful in my life. I told her that I had made it that morning without thinking much of it, and that there was a small note folded inside, words I had written without expecting anyone would ever read them. She turned the crane slowly in her claws, studying it with an intensity that seemed disproportionate to something so small and simple. Around us, the attendants remained frozen in their kneeling positions, and I noticed that none of them dared lift their heads to watch what was happening, as though even witnessing this moment carried some kind of danger. Ambassador Clark, standing several steps behind me, had gone completely silent, his earlier panicked apologies dying in his throat the moment the Queen Mother spoke without anger. Commander Bennett's hand, I would learn later, had been resting on the emergency signal device clipped to her belt the entire time, ready to call for immediate evacuation if things turned violent. The Queen Mother asked me to open the crane and read the note aloud. I hesitated only a moment before carefully unfolding the small paper shape, my fingers slightly unsteady, aware that every movement I made was being watched by dozens of eyes that had likely never seen a human hand do anything before. I read the words I had written that morning, simple and unremarkable, a small wish for understanding between our peoples, nothing more elaborate than that. When I finished, the chamber remained silent for a long moment. Then something happened that I do not think anyone in that room expected, myself included. The Queen Mother rose from her throne. I had not realized, until she stood, exactly how tall she truly was, her long plaited body unfolding upward until she towered over even the guards standing near her. The attendants along the walls pressed themselves even lower against the floor, and I heard several sharp intakes of breath from the Vashtari members of the court, though I could not tell if it was fear or shock or something else entirely. She descended the short steps from her throne, moving with a slow, deliberate grace, still holding the small paper crane cradled in one clawed hand, as though it were something fragile and precious, rather than a scrap of folded napkin. She stopped directly in front of me, close enough now that I could see fine details in the plating along her body, subtle patterns like frost across dark glass, and up close her 4 eyes seemed less alien and more simply tired, in a way I recognized from long nights and longer responsibilities. She said, quietly enough that I suspected the translator was working to keep the volume appropriate to the moment, that no one had given her anything without being asked in longer than she could remember. I did not know how to respond to that. I remember opening my mouth and closing it again, uncertain what words could possibly fit a moment like this. Before I could find something to say, she turned toward the rest of the chamber, and her voice shifted, becoming harder, more formal, more suited to command. She announced that the human delegation would be granted an extended audience, and that all other matters scheduled for that day would be postponed. I heard Ambassador Clark exhale audibly behind me, clearly relieved that whatever consequence he expected had not arrived, at least not yet. The Queen Mother instructed her guards to escort the rest of the delegation to a separate waiting chamber, and then, in a tone that left no room for argument, stated that she wished to speak with me alone. I saw Commander Bennett's jaw tighten at that, and for a moment I thought she might object, might insist on staying with me despite the clear command. But protocol training had taught all of us that refusing a direct order from the Queen Mother, especially one delivered in that particular tone, would be far more dangerous than complying. She gave me one sharp glance, a silent instruction to be careful, and then allowed herself to be led from the chamber along with the others. I watched them go, feeling suddenly very small and very alone in that vast stone room, standing before a being who ruled star systems, holding nothing now but empty hands and the growing certainty that I had stepped into something far larger than a simple diplomatic mistake. Once the chamber had emptied of everyone except a handful of silent guards positioned near the walls, the Queen Mother gestured for me to follow her toward a smaller side chamber, one I had not noticed before, tucked behind the throne itself. This room was different from the grand hall we had just left. Smaller, quieter, lit by the same faint amber veins running through the walls, but without the imposing scale of the throne room. There were no attendants here, no guards standing at attention, only a low stone bench along one wall and what looked like shelves carved directly into the rock, holding objects I did not recognize. The Queen Mother settled onto the bench, still holding the paper crane, and for a long moment simply looked at it without speaking. I remained standing, uncertain whether sitting without permission would be another violation of some rule I did not know existed. Finally, she spoke again, her voice quieter now, almost contemplative. She told me that among her people, what I had done carried a specific meaning, one that most humans could not have understood without years of study. Personal, unscripted gestures directed at a ruling queen, gifts offered outside of formal ceremony, without prior approval or negotiation, were forbidden. Not simply discouraged, forbidden, under penalty of death, for longer than her empire had kept written records. I felt my stomach drop at those words, understanding for the first time exactly how close I had come to ending my own life with a folded napkin. I asked, as carefully as I could, why such a small thing carried such a severe punishment. She was quiet for a long moment before answering, and when she did, her voice carried a weight I had not expected from someone with such absolute power. She explained that queens of her line were raised from birth, in complete isolation from anything resembling personal affection. Every interaction a queen experienced, from her earliest days, was structured, formal, transactional. Tutors taught her strategy and history and warfare. Advisors taught her politics and diplomacy. Attendants existed to serve her needs, but never to know her, never to offer her anything without being commanded to do so first. This isolation, she said, was not cruelty for its own sake. It was protection. A queen who could be moved by affection, who could be swayed by a gift or a kind word, was a queen who could be exploited by anyone clever enough to offer the right gesture at the right moment. Her own mother, she told me, had died from a slow poison hidden inside a gift offered by a suitor who claimed to care for her, decades before I was born. Since that day, the law had been absolute. No unscripted gifts, no unsanctioned affection. Anyone who violated this law, regardless of intention, faced execution, both to protect the queen from manipulation and to remind every citizen of the empire that a queen's heart, whatever remained of it beneath centuries of careful training, was not something to be won or exploited. I stood in that quiet stone chamber, holding the weight of everything she had just told me, and slowly began to understand exactly what I had done. I had not simply broken a rule. I had, without meaning to, offered the single most dangerous thing imaginable to a being who had been taught her entire life that such things could kill her. And yet she had not executed me. She had not even ordered my removal. Instead, she sat before me, still holding a folded scrap of napkin as though it were the most valuable object in her entire empire, looking at me with an expression I still did not fully understand. I asked, quietly, why she had not simply let her guards do what the law demanded. She looked down at the crane again before answering, turning it slowly in her claws. She said that she had spent her entire life being given things: tribute, treaties, weapons, territory. Every gift she had ever received had been calculated, weighed, offered with some expectation of return. Every kindness shown to her had been a transaction disguised as generosity. This, she said, gesturing slightly with the crane, was different. I had given her something with no possible strategic value, something that could not be traded or leveraged, something that existed only because I had felt, in that moment, that she deserved a small kindness with no strings attached. She said this was the first time in longer than she could remember that anyone had offered her something without wanting anything in return. I did not know what to say to that. I still do not know, even now, if there were words adequate to that moment. She asked me then whether I understood what I had risked by stepping forward the way I had. I admitted that I had not fully understood in the moment, that it had felt like instinct more than decision, a small human impulse I had not been able to override despite months of careful training. She studied me for a long moment, her 4 eyes moving slowly across my face, and then said something that has stayed with me every day since. She said that instinct, uncalculated and unguarded, was precisely what had been trained out of her since birth, and that watching it in someone else, even for a brief moment, felt like remembering something she had lost before she was old enough to know she had lost it at all. I felt the weight of that confession settle over the room like a held breath. Before either of us could say anything else, a sharp sound echoed from beyond the chamber door, distant but unmistakable, the sound of raised voices and hurried footsteps. The Queen Mother's expression shifted instantly, the softness I had glimpsed moments earlier hardening back into something more guarded, more careful. She rose from the bench, tucking the small paper crane into a fold of the plating along her side, as though hiding it from view. She told me, quickly and quietly, that word of what had happened in the throne room would already be spreading through the court, and that not everyone would react the way she had. I asked what she meant, and she said only that some among her advisors would see this as an opportunity, and that I needed to be very careful about what I said to anyone outside this room. The chamber door opened before I could ask anything further, and I saw Commander Bennett standing in the doorway, flanked by 2 Vashtari guards, her expression tight with barely controlled tension. Behind her, I could hear more voices approaching, sharper and more urgent than before, and I understood, with a sinking feeling in my chest, that whatever had happened in that small, quiet chamber between the Queen Mother and myself was already spilling out into something far larger than either of us could control. The Queen Mother's eyes met mine one final time before the moment shattered into motion and noise, and in that brief look I read something that felt almost like a warning, and almost like a plea. Whatever came next, her expression seemed to say, we were both about to find out exactly how forbidden this small kindness truly was. Commander Bennett's hand closed around my arm the moment I stepped through the chamber door, her grip tight enough to leave marks. She did not speak until we were moving quickly down the corridor, flanked by guards on either side, their long strides forcing us to nearly jog to keep pace. Only then did she lean close and ask, in a voice sharp with barely restrained fury, what exactly I thought I had been doing. I tried to explain, stumbling over the words, describing the crane, the note, the strange quiet conversation that had followed. She listened without interrupting, her jaw growing tighter with every sentence. until I finished, and she simply stared at me for a long moment before shaking her head. She said that whatever had happened in that private chamber, the rest of the court had not been so quiet. Word had already spread that the Queen Mother had accepted an unsanctioned gift from a human, had spoken with him alone, had shown him a kindness reserved for no one. She said the corridors outside the throne room were already buzzing with whispered arguments, and that Ambassador Clark was currently trying to contain a situation that seemed to be growing worse by the minute. We reached the waiting chamber to find exactly that. Ambassador Clark stood near the center of the room, surrounded by several Vashtari court officials, their voices overlapping in sharp bursts of clicking language that the translators struggled to keep pace with. Peter Grant stood near the wall, looking pale and uncertain, and when he saw me enter, his relief was immediate and obvious. One of the court officials, a tall figure with dark plating and a voice that carried an edge of barely restrained anger, turned toward me the moment I entered. He demanded to know exactly what had transpired between myself and the Queen Mother, his tone making it clear that he considered the entire situation a personal insult. I glanced toward Ambassador Clark, uncertain how much I was permitted to share, and he gave a small, tense nod, granting me permission to speak. I explained again, as simply as I could, exactly what had happened: the crane, the note, the Queen Mother's questions. I did not mention the private conversation that followed, the story of her mother, the confession about isolation and instinct, sensing instinctively that those details belonged only to her. The official's expression, if it could be called that, twisted into something that looked remarkably like disgust. He said that regardless of the Queen Mother's reaction, the law remained absolute, and that allowing a human to violate it without consequence would be seen throughout the empire as a sign of weakness. Another official, standing slightly behind him, added that rival factions within the court had already begun circulating the story, framing it as evidence that the Queen Mother could be manipulated by outsiders, that her judgment could not be trusted if she allowed such violations to pass unpunished. I felt the floor shift beneath me, understanding for the first time just how quickly a small, personal moment had transformed into a political weapon. Commander Bennett stepped forward then, her voice calm but firm, insisting that any judgment regarding the incident belonged to the Queen Mother alone, and that our delegation would respect whatever decision she reached. It was a careful answer, diplomatic and safe, but I could see in her eyes that she was as uncertain as the rest of us about what that decision might be. The officials exchanged a look before departing, their footsteps sharp and hurried against the stone floor, leaving our small group alone in the waiting chamber. The moment the door closed behind them, Ambassador Clark turned to me, his expression a mixture of exhaustion and barely controlled frustration. He asked, quietly, why I had done it. I did not have a clean answer. I told him the truth, that it had not been a calculated decision, that something in the moment had simply felt wrong, watching a being surrounded by so much power and so little warmth, and that some part of me had acted before I had fully thought it through. He was quiet for a long moment, rubbing his temples, before saying that regardless of my reasons, the consequences were now entirely out of our hands. He said our entire mission, the treaty we had spent 2 years negotiating, the fragile trust between our species, could all collapse because of a folded piece of paper. I felt the weight of that responsibility settle over me like a physical thing, heavy and suffocating. We were confined to our quarters for the remainder of that day, informed only that the Queen Mother would communicate her decision regarding the incident when she was ready. The waiting stretched on for hours, each one heavier than the last, filled with quiet arguments among our delegation about what might happen next. Peter tried to reassure me at one point, saying that surely, if the Queen Mother had wanted me punished, she would have acted immediately rather than sending us away to wait. I appreciated the attempt, though I could see in his eyes that he did not fully believe his own words. Commander Bennett spent much of that time in quiet conversation with Ambassador Clark, discussing contingency plans, ways to salvage the treaty if the worst occurred, ways to explain my actions to command back home if this incident became public. I overheard fragments of these conversations, phrases like rogue actor and diplomatic immunity, and containing the damage, and each one made me feel smaller and more isolated than the last. It was late into that first night, according to the ship's internal clock we still use to track time, when a message arrived summoning me alone to a meeting the following morning. I did not sleep well that night. I kept turning the entire encounter over in my mind, replaying the Queen Mother's words, her expression, the way she had looked at that small paper crane, as though it were the most valuable object she had ever held. I could not shake the feeling that something significant had shifted in that quiet chamber, something far beyond the simple violation of a diplomatic rule. The following morning, I was escorted back through the palace corridors, though this time the guards accompanying me seemed less hostile, almost cautious in their movements, as though uncertain how to treat someone who had somehow earned the Queen Mother's private attention. I was brought not to the throne room, but to a different chamber entirely, one filled with soft light, and rows of strange glowing plants growing along the walls, their leaves pulsing faintly in shades of blue and violet. The Queen Mother sat near the center of this room, on a low seat rather than her towering throne, looking somehow smaller and more approachable in this quieter setting. She dismissed the guards the moment I entered, and once we were alone, gestured for me to sit on a similar low seat positioned nearby. I sat carefully, uncertain what to expect, and waited for her to speak. She told me, without preamble, that the situation had grown more complicated than she had initially anticipated. Several factions within her court had seized upon the incident, using it to challenge her authority, suggesting that her willingness to overlook such a severe violation proved she was no longer fit to rule with the absolute clarity her position demanded. I asked what that meant for me, and for the treaty between our peoples. She was quiet for a long moment before answering, her 4 eyes distant, as though weighing possibilities I could not begin to guess at. She said that her advisors were pressing her to enforce the law as written, to have me quietly removed in a way that would satisfy tradition without creating a public spectacle. She said this would resolve the political pressure she currently faced, restoring the perception of her strength and control. My chest tightened at those words, understanding exactly what quietly removed likely meant. But then she said something else. She said that her own instincts, the very instincts she had spent her entire life being trained to suppress, told her that such an action would be wrong, not simply because it would cost a human life for something so small, but because it would mean silencing the one genuine, uncalculated moment she had experienced in longer than she could remember. She said she found herself, for the first time in her reign, uncertain about which choice was correct. I did not know what to say to that. I sat in silence, feeling the weight of a decision far larger than myself pressing down on that quiet room. She asked me then what I believed she should do. I hesitated before answering, aware that whatever I said next might carry consequences neither of us could fully predict. I told her that I could not claim to understand the full weight of her responsibilities, the pressures of ruling an empire built on centuries of careful tradition. But I told her that from what I had seen in that small chamber the previous day, the fear in her advisors seemed to come from a belief that kindness itself was dangerous, that any crack in her isolation would inevitably be exploited by someone seeking to control her. I told her that perhaps the answer was not to prove she could not be moved by kindness, but to prove that being moved by kindness did not make her weak, that recognizing a genuine gesture and responding to it with wisdom rather than fear might actually demonstrate a strength her advisors had never considered. She listened to all of this without interrupting, her expression unreadable in the soft, pulsing light of the chamber. When I finished, she remained silent for a long moment, and then said quietly that such a choice would not be simple, that it would likely cost her politically, weakening her position among rivals who were already circling, searching for any sign of vulnerability. I asked what would happen to the treaty between our peoples if she made that choice. She admitted she did not know. She said that some of her advisors believed that showing leniency toward a human would embolden other species within her empire to test similar boundaries, undermining centuries of carefully maintained order. She said others believed that punishing me severely would poison any chance of genuine trust between our species going forward, ensuring that humanity would always see the Vashtari Empire as something to be feared rather than understood. I realized, sitting there, that the decision she faced was not simply about my life, though that weighed heavily enough on its own. It was about what kind of ruler she intended to become, and what kind of relationship would define the future between our two peoples for generations to come. She rose from her seat then, moving toward one of the glowing plants along the wall, running her claws gently along its leaves as she spoke. She said that she needed time to consider everything carefully, that the decision she made would need to be announced publicly, in front of the full court, to satisfy both the demands of tradition and the questions now circulating throughout her empire. She told me that until that announcement, I would remain confined to our delegation's quarters, under guard, for my own protection as much as anything else. I asked, quietly, whether she believed I had made the right choice in offering her that small gift. She turned back to face me, her expression softening slightly in a way I was beginning to recognize, and said that regardless of what tradition demanded, she did not regret the moment itself, only the complications it had created. She said that whatever she decided, she wanted me to understand that the gesture had mattered to her, more than perhaps anything offered to her in her entire adult life. I left that chamber feeling no more certain about my fate than when I had entered, but carrying something else alongside that uncertainty, a strange, quiet hope that perhaps something meaningful had been set into motion, regardless of how it ultimately resolved. Little did I know, as I walked back through those glowing corridors under careful guard, that the following days would bring challenges far more dangerous than anything I had yet imagined, and that the fate of two entire species would soon rest on choices neither the Queen Mother nor I could fully control. The knock on our quarters came just before dawn, sharp and urgent, nothing like the measured formality of the guards who usually escorted us through the palace. I was awake instantly, along with Peter and Commander Bennett, all three of us exchanging tense glances as Ambassador Clark opened the door to find not palace guards, but a single Vashtari figure I did not recognize, cloaked in dark fabric that seemed designed to avoid attention rather than display status. The figure spoke quickly, quietly, in a dialect our translators struggled to process smoothly. Ambassador Clark's expression shifted from confusion to alarm as the meaning became clear. There was a plot forming within the court, the figure explained, one that intended to use the incident with the crane as justification for a challenge to the Queen Mother's authority itself. A rival faction, led by a court official named Threxa Val, believed that the Queen Mother's leniency toward me proved she had grown weak, vulnerable to manipulation, unfit to continue ruling without challenge. Commander Bennett asked why this stranger was warning us at all, given the risk clearly involved in doing so. The figure hesitated before answering, finally admitting that not everyone within the court agreed with Threxa Val's ambitions, and that some believed the Queen Mother's willingness to show mercy, however unconventional, represented something valuable worth protecting. Before we could ask anything further, the figure turned and disappeared back into the corridor, leaving us standing in stunned silence. Ambassador Clark wasted no time contacting the Queen Mother's personal attendants, requesting an urgent audience. The response came faster than I expected, guards arriving within minutes to escort not just me, but our entire delegation, back toward the throne room. The chamber, when we arrived, felt different from before. Tension hung in the air like static before a storm, and I noticed additional guards stationed along the walls, their postures rigid and alert, in a way that suggested they anticipated trouble. The Queen Mother sat upon her throne, her expression carefully neutral, though I could see something tighter around her eyes that told me she was already aware of the danger circling her court. Ambassador Clark relayed the warning we had received, and the Queen Mother listened without visible surprise, confirming that she had already received similar reports from her own sources. She explained that Threxa Val had long harbored ambitions toward greater influence within the court, and that the incident with the crane had simply provided the pretext he needed to move against her more openly than he had previously dared. Commander Bennett asked directly what this meant for our safety and for the treaty we had come here to negotiate. The Queen Mother's answer was measured, careful, though I could hear the weight beneath her words. She said that Threxaval intended to force a public challenge, invoking ancient tradition that allowed any sufficiently ranked court official to contest a ruler's judgment before the full assembly, provided they could demonstrate that the ruler's decision endangered the stability of the empire itself. She said that if this challenge proceeded, and she was found to have acted incorrectly in showing me leniency, the consequences would extend far beyond my own fate. It would establish precedent that her judgment could be questioned and overturned, weakening her authority permanently and potentially plunging her court into the kind of internal conflict that had, centuries ago, nearly destroyed the empire from within. I felt sick hearing this, understanding that my small, impulsive gesture had grown into something that threatened not just my own life, but the stability of an entire civilization. I asked, quietly, whether there was anything I could do to help resolve this without making things worse. The Queen Mother studied me for a long moment before answering, and when she spoke, her voice carried a weight I had not heard from her before. She said that Threxaval's challenge would take the form of a formal hearing, held before the full assembly of court officials, during which both sides would present their case. She said that if I were willing, my presence and testimony during that hearing might provide context that could sway opinion in her favor, though it would also expose me directly to the judgment of an assembly that largely viewed my actions as a threat to their entire way of governance. Commander Bennett immediately objected, arguing that exposing me to such a hearing carried enormous risk, that if the assembly turned against the Queen Mother's position, I could be sentenced to execution on the spot, with no opportunity for outside intervention. The Queen Mother acknowledged this risk without hesitation, saying she would not order me to participate, that the choice needed to be entirely my own. I sat with that decision for a long moment, feeling the eyes of my own delegation upon me, waiting to see what I would choose. I thought about the quiet chamber, where she had first shown me that small crack of vulnerability beneath centuries of isolation. I thought about her words, about instinct and kindness, and the strange, uncalculated moment I had offered her without meaning to start anything at all. I thought about what it would mean for both our species if fear and tradition were allowed to crush that moment simply because it was inconvenient and dangerous. I told her that I would testify. The hearing was set for the following day, giving us little time to prepare. Ambassador Clark spent hours coaching me on diplomatic language, careful phrasing that might help, without inadvertently making things worse. Commander Bennett insisted on accompanying me into the chamber, refusing to allow me to face the assembly entirely alone, despite the Queen Mother's warning that human presence beyond myself might be viewed unfavorably by traditionalists within the court. That night, unable to sleep, I found myself thinking about home, about the quiet, ordinary life I had left behind to join this mission. I thought about how strange it was that a single small gesture, born from nothing more than a fleeting moment of empathy, had brought me to the edge of becoming either a historical footnote or a casualty in an alien political struggle I barely understood. The hearing chamber, when we arrived the following morning, was larger than the throne room itself, built in tiers that rose upward like an amphitheater, filled with hundreds of Vashtari court officials, their attention fixed on the small open space at the center where I now stood, flanked by Commander Bennett and Ambassador Clark. The Queen Mother sat elevated above the assembly, her expression carefully composed, though I could see tension in the set of her shoulders that told me even she was uncertain how this would unfold. Threxaval stood near the center of the chamber, tall and imposing, his dark plating catching the amber light in sharp angles as he began his formal challenge. His argument, delivered with practiced eloquence, painted the Queen Mother's leniency as a dangerous precedent, one that threatened the very foundations of order that had allowed their empire to endure for centuries. He spoke of her mother's assassination, of the careful traditions built specifically to prevent such vulnerabilities, and argued that allowing an outsider to violate those traditions without consequence proved that she had already been compromised, whether through weakness or manipulation. I felt the weight of hundreds of alien eyes upon me as he spoke, many of them clearly sympathetic to his argument, and understood with growing dread just how difficult this fight would be. When it came my turn to speak, my voice shook slightly, though I forced myself to steady it as best I could. I did not try to argue tradition, or law, or politics, knowing I understood none of these things well enough to debate them convincingly. Instead, I spoke about the moment itself. I described watching the Queen Mother receive tribute after tribute, surrounded by hundreds of attendants, and recognizing something painfully familiar in the isolation behind her composed exterior. I explained that my gesture had not been calculated, had not been intended as any kind of political statement, but had come from a simple human impulse to offer kindness, where I sensed someone needed it. I told the assembly that punishing such a gesture with death would not prove the Queen Mother's strength. It would only prove that fear, rather than wisdom, still ruled their empire, generations after the tragedy that had created these laws in the first place. I saw Threxaval's expression tighten at my words, and heard murmurs ripple through the assembled officials, though I could not tell whether they leaned toward agreement or anger. The Queen Mother remained silent throughout this exchange, her expression unreadable, and I understood that whatever she ultimately decided, this moment belonged to her alone. When both sides had finished speaking, she rose from her throne, and the entire chamber fell into absolute silence, waiting for her judgment. She looked out across the assembly for a long moment before speaking, and when she finally did, her voice carried a strength I had not heard from her before. Neither the careful formality of the throne room nor the quiet vulnerability of our private conversations, but something new entirely, forged from the weight of the choice she was about to make. She said that she had spent her entire life being taught that kindness was a weakness to be feared, that any crack in her isolation represented a vulnerability that could be exploited by those seeking to control her. She said this lesson had been taught through pain, through the loss of her own mother, and that she understood exactly why such laws had been created. But she said that a ruler who could not survive being offered a moment of genuine kindness without collapsing into weakness was not a ruler worth protecting in the first place. She said that true strength was not found in isolation and fear, but in the wisdom to recognize the difference between manipulation and sincerity, and the courage to respond to each appropriately. She announced, in that moment, before the entire assembled court, that she was rewriting the ancient law, allowing for judgment and discernment rather than blind, absolute prohibition. The chamber erupted into a chaos of overlapping voices, some raised in outrage, others in something that sounded almost like relief, and I stood frozen at the center of it all, understanding that history was being rewritten in front of me, sparked by nothing more than a folded piece of napkin and a note I had never expected anyone to read. The weeks that followed the Queen Mother's declaration were unlike anything I had experienced before or since. Threxaval did not accept her decision quietly. In the days immediately after the hearing, rumors spread rapidly throughout the court that he intended to rally other dissatisfied officials, hoping to force a more direct confrontation over her authority. Commander Bennett kept our delegation on high alert during this period, uncertain whether the political instability within the Vashtari court might spill over into direct danger for us. The Queen Mother, however, moved with a decisiveness that surprised even her own advisors. Rather than allowing Threxaval's faction time to consolidate support, she called for an immediate reorganization of her council, replacing several officials who had shown clear sympathy toward his position with others whose loyalty and judgment she trusted more completely. I learned much of this secondhand, through careful conversations with Ambassador Clark, and occasional updates from the same cloaked figure who had first warned us of the plot against her, a Vashtari official named Aldrich Venn, who I came to understand had quietly supported the Queen Mother's more compassionate instincts long before I ever arrived on their world. Aldrich explained to me, during one of these quiet conversations, that the Queen Mother's decision had done more than simply spare my life. It had created ripples throughout the empire, reaching species far beyond the Vashtari themselves. For centuries, the client species living under Vashtari rule had existed in careful, fearful silence, never daring to offer anything beyond formal tribute, never certain whether even the smallest gesture of genuine connection might be misinterpreted as dangerous manipulation. Word of the Queen Mother's declaration spread quickly among these species, carried through whispered conversations and careful diplomatic channels, and Aldrich told me that for the first time in living memory, some of these smaller, quieter worlds were beginning to wonder whether a different kind of relationship with their ruling empire might be possible. This shift did not happen without resistance. Threxa Val continued pressing his challenge through subtler means, working to undermine the Queen Mother's authority through careful political maneuvering rather than open confrontation. There were tense weeks where the outcome of this quiet struggle remained genuinely uncertain, and I remember lying awake more than once, wondering whether everything set into motion by that small paper crane might still collapse into disaster. But the Queen Mother proved more capable than her rivals anticipated. She navigated the political challenges with a combination of firmness and unexpected openness, meeting with representatives from client species who had never before been granted direct audience, listening to grievances that had gone unspoken for generations simply because no one had ever dared voice them. I was present for several of these meetings, invited by the Queen Mother herself, though I mostly remained silent, watching as she slowly began transforming the rigid, fear-based structure of her court into something more flexible, more genuinely connected to the peoples she ruled. Threxa Val's influence gradually diminished as more officials, seeing the positive reception these changes received throughout the empire, began aligning themselves with the Queen Mother rather than against her. Within 2 months of the hearing, he had lost enough support that his earlier challenge became little more than a footnote in the empire's history, remembered mostly as the moment that had, ironically, accelerated the very changes he had tried to prevent. Meanwhile, our own treaty negotiations, which I had feared might collapse entirely under the weight of political chaos, instead found new life. The Queen Mother, perhaps influenced by everything she had experienced during those turbulent weeks, approached the remaining discussions with humanity with a warmth and genuine curiosity that surprised even Ambassador Clark, who had spent years preparing for a purely transactional relationship with the Vashtari Empire. She asked questions during our sessions that went beyond simple diplomatic necessity, curious about human customs, human history, the strange traditions that had led someone like myself to fold a small paper shape out of nervous habit and offer it to a stranger without expecting anything in return. I found myself during these months growing into an unofficial role I had never anticipated, something between translator and cultural liaison, helping bridge small gaps of understanding between our two peoples that went beyond formal treaty language. Peter Grant, watching this transformation unfold, joked more than once that I had somehow become more valuable to the mission by breaking protocol than I ever would have been by following it perfectly. Commander Bennett, though initially furious about my impulsive actions, eventually admitted, during a quiet moment near the end of our mission, that she had never seen a diplomatic breakthrough achieved through such an unconventional path, and that perhaps some rules existed not because they were always correct, but because no one had yet found the courage to question them. The final treaty signing took place nearly 4 months after that first fateful audience, in a ceremony far less rigid and fearful than the one that had begun this entire journey. The Queen Mother presided over the event with a confidence that seemed genuinely her own, rather than a performance dictated by centuries of isolated tradition. Before the formal signing began, she asked to speak with me privately one final time, in the same quiet chamber filled with glowing plants, where she had first confided in me about her mother's death and the weight of the laws built from that tragedy. She held the small paper crane, still carefully preserved, despite the months that had passed, and told me that she had decided to keep it permanently among her personal belongings, a reminder of the moment that had changed not just her own life, but the trajectory of her entire empire. She asked whether I had any regrets about what my small, impulsive gesture had set into motion. I told her honestly that I had feared, many times over those difficult months, that I had made a catastrophic mistake, one that might cost not just my own life, but the fragile trust between our two species. But I told her that watching everything unfold, watching her transform her court into something more open and more genuinely connected to the people she governed, I could not regret a single moment of it. She smiled, or at least performed whatever expression among her people served the same purpose, and told me that she believed history would remember this moment not as a violation of ancient law, but as the beginning of something far more valuable, a relationship built on genuine understanding rather than fear and careful transaction. The formal treaty was signed later that day, establishing not just trade and diplomatic relations between humanity and the Vashtari Empire, but a framework for deeper cultural exchange that no one on our original delegation had dared hope for when we first arrived on that strange, storm-covered world. I returned home several weeks later, carrying with me memories of an experience I still struggle to fully explain to those who ask about it. I did not set out to make history. I did not intend to challenge centuries of tradition or reshape the internal politics of an alien empire, or forge a new kind of relationship between two entirely different species. I simply saw someone who seemed profoundly alone, surrounded by more power and more isolation than I could truly comprehend, and I offered the only thing I had available in that moment, a small folded piece of paper and a handful of quiet words. I have thought often, in the time since returning home, about how easily that moment could have ended differently. If the Queen Mother had reacted with less curiosity, or if Threxaval's challenge had gathered just slightly more support, this story might have ended with my execution rather than a treaty signing, remembered only as a cautionary tale about the dangers of ignoring careful diplomatic protocol. But it did not end that way, and I have come to believe that the outcome, however uncertain it felt in the moment, revealed something true about both our species. That even across the vast differences separating humanity from the Vashtari Empire, the simple, uncalculated impulse toward kindness remains something powerful enough to reshape even the oldest, most deeply entrenched traditions. I still keep one of those paper cranes on my desk at home, a quiet reminder of everything that unfolded from such a small and unplanned gesture. I did not know, standing nervously in that throne room all those months ago, that I was making history. I only knew that I could not stand quietly and watch someone remain that alone, surrounded by so much power and so very little genuine connection, without at least trying to offer something real. Sometimes, I have come to understand, the smallest and most forbidden gestures carry the greatest power to change everything that follows.